Since well before Victor Hugo first looked at Notre Dame and thought, what if a hunchback lived in there? Writers have been inspired by Paris. Welcome to the Storytime in Paris podcast on Paris Underground Radio. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, an award-winning filmmaker, self-professed book nerd, and creator of the Paris Underground Radio podcast network. This podcast is for anyone who loves books, loves authors, loves France, or any combination therein. Each week, I'll speak with an author whose life, stories, or characters have a connection to France. Then these amoureux de livres will treat us to a reading from their book. My guest this week is USA Today and internationally best-selling author Kimberly Belle. Kimberly was a Goodreads Choice Awards semi-finalist for Best Mystery and Thriller, whose books have sold over 1 million copies worldwide. Her books have been optioned for film and television and selected by Library Reads and Amazon and Apple Books editors as the best books of the month and the International Thriller Writers as nominee for Best Book of the Year. Kimberly's latest mystery/thriller is The Paris Widow. In it, Stella and Adam are married and very much in love. They have been gallivanting all over Europe on vacation with a little side of Adam's work. In Paris, mere hours before they are set to return home, there is a giant explosion. And now, Adam is missing and presumed dead. But with his death comes all sorts of questions. Was Adam actually a notorious criminal? Was that attack meant for him? Who is following Stella and why? And was anything he ever told her the truth? Please allow me to introduce Kimberly Belle, author of The Paris Widow. Hello, Kimberly. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am very excited to talk to you about The Paris Widow. But before we dive into that, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, of course. I'm Kimberly Belle, and I write thrillers for a living. The Paris Widow is, I guess, number 11 officially, although I've co-written a couple of those, so maybe they don't get a full point on the scale. But yeah, so it's my 11th book.
That's incredible. I think you get full credit. Writing a book is a big, big deal. So credit where credit is due.
Well, thank you. Then I'll take it.
And do you have a personal connection to Paris or to France?
Well, the connection, I guess, is that I lived for half the year in Europe. I once upon a time lived here full time in Amsterdam. Well, actually, when we lived here, we lived outside of Amsterdam. But now that the kids are older, I actually have one kid who lives here in Amsterdam, and all my in-laws live here. And we have tons of friends. So once the kids were out of the house, we were like, well, we should just go live there for half the year. And so we kind of chased the sun and come here in the summertime in the nice weather. And then we escape during the winters back to the States. So I guess my connection with Paris is that I can hop a train and be there in 3.5 hours?
That is not a bad connection.
I love it.
So will you tell us a little bit about The Paris Widow?
Sure. So The Paris Widow is a story about Stella and Adam. They are a married couple who are on the vacation of a lifetime. They're doing a 3-week tour through Europe, some of Stella's favorite places that she wants to see with her husband. And on the very last day of their trip, they are having their last lunch in Paris when disaster strikes and a bomb explodes in the cafe where Adam is sitting. So in the chaos and the drama of the coming days, as she's trying to figure out where her husband is, if he's okay, the police come to her and they tell her that he wasn't just one of the victims, but the actual target of the explosion.
It's just such an exciting synopsis. It's very good. I mean, I've already read it and it makes you want to read it, you know?
Yay, I love it.
But in looking over your bibliography, this is not your first widow-related novel. You have Desperately Deadly Widows and Young Rich Widows, and now The Paris Widow. Where does this fascination with widows come from?
The two that you just mentioned, the Young Rich Widows and Desperate Deadly Widows, those are the two that I co-wrote. So I will say that I was not the one who came up with the premise for those particular books. They were a lot of fun to write, and they're very different than this story, than my solo books, because they're set in the 80s. They're kind of campy. There's mobsters, there's wolves, there's like all kinds of crazy shenanigans that go on. Very, very 80s themed. And they're a lot of fun, but my solo books typically center around a couple, and often they're married, and often one, maybe both of them, are keeping some really big secrets from the other. So I'm trying to think, is this the first one that I've written where there's a widow? No, probably not. This is the first one that is titled something widow. But one of my other big titles is called The Marriage Lie. So that kind of tells you about the types of books that I write.
Well, that was another thing that I noticed. In a lot of your books, there seems to be this question of betrayal by the person closest to the narrator, whether it's like the lover or the husband or the wife or the best friend, something like this. So what do you think it is that draws you as a writer and us as a reader to explore this theme that would be so heart-wrenching and devastating in real life?
Yeah, and I get asked this question a lot, especially from people who know me and know a little bit about my life, that I've been married and happily married for 30 some years. But I think it's this universal thing. Even if you've never been married, you can still put yourself in that position of sharing a house, sharing a roof, sharing a bed with someone, and finding something really horrible, awful out about them, and how that changes your relationship, how it changes how you think about that person, and how it also changes a lot of times the line that you thought you had in the sand about forgiveness. Because, hand in hand with these kind of themes is forgiveness or not. A lot of people think that, they can forgive up to here. They have a line in the sand that they draw. I can forgive you up to here, and after that, I can't. But when you find out something devastating about someone, and you also discover maybe the reasons why they did what they did, if they're valid, sometimes that line in the sand can move. And I just love exploring those kind of themes. I think there are a million different stories I could tell about those. And I think it's something that everyone can relate to, readers can relate to, and maybe have been in some of those situations themselves, maybe hopefully without the bombs. But, being in a situation where you're discovering something that you didn't know about the person, one of the people you love most in the world.
Yeah, there's always that voice in the back of your head that's like, I think I know you completely, but do I really? And what would be the one thing that I could find out that would completely revolutionize the way that I feel about you?
Exactly. Exactly. I think there's a lot of stories that can be told about those kind of themes.
Yeah. And there's the opposite of that too, where it's like, this is someone I love so much, I would lie for them, or I would kill for them, or I would whatever. And would you really? And where is the line there where suddenly you would be like, no, this is someone that I would turn in for committing a crime.
Right. I've written those kind of stories too, where, you get sucked into this position and maybe you don't have much time to think about it. And they ask you to say something that is maybe not entirely true to the authorities. And you do it just because you don't have time to really consider all the ramifications of it. So I think there's a lot and the stories can go all different kinds of ways.
Yeah, they're fascinating questions of morality and loyalty and trust and blind trust and all that. I think that's why we love this genre.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And that's why I love to write it too.
Well, I appreciate that. And this book specifically ends up exploring a lot of different and really fascinating subcultures. And you talk about this a bit in the afterword, but can you talk to us about where the idea for this book came from?
Yeah. So when I first started this story, I pitched it to my editor with Adam, the husband, being in some sort of financial job. And I don't remember exactly the details of it or the details of what his crime was going to be or his shenanigans, I guess, were going to be. But my editor at the time said, I'd really love for him to have something that's a little more tangible because finance can be complicated. And so I started researching other kinds of jobs that he could have. And I don't exactly remember how I landed on it exactly, but I came up with that he was going to be in the antique industry, specifically antiques from old buildings, European buildings. So he did a lot of buying trips to France and around Europe, Western Europe, looking for, reclaimed flooring, those kind of things. So he has a shop back in Atlanta. But as soon as I found the antiques business and started doing a little research into that, I discovered that it really goes hand in hand with what they call blood antiquities, which is fascinating and shocking how humongous the industry is for blood antiquities. So these historical pieces that are being ripped out of temples, churches, often museums in war-torn countries, smuggled over the international borders and sold to the highest bidder. And often the highest bidder is a legitimate buyer, like a gallery, a museum, private collectors. So as soon as I landed on that and I saw the breadth and the craziness that is the trading of blood antiquities, I knew I had landed on a real big story there.
It's a fascinating world to delve into. I feel like it's one that we hear a little bit about. You dance around, especially living in Europe, you hear about it, I guess, a bit more, but it's not one that I'd ever really read very much about. So it was a fun read to dive into this world a bit and learn a bit more.
Yeah, like I said, it's fascinating and shocking at the same time, which is the perfect ingredients for a story like this one.
Will you tell us a little bit about the real person that Cat was based on? Because that seems like someone we should know about.
Yeah, he is actually super fascinating. His name is Arthur Brand, Brand, and he is Dutch. He lives here in Holland, and he calls himself an art detective, and that's his entire mission, is to go out and find these historical pieces that have either disappeared or been lost, or he'll follow these clues. He'll go undercover. He does all kinds of crazy, scary things, works with people who probably are not entirely above board when it comes to, legalities, but he'll risk his own life to find these pieces and then reclaim them and return them to their rightful owners. So not just Cat in this book, but a lot of the pieces that I talk about, including the Arthur Wilde ring, which is a big plot device in this story. It's a ring that I don't remember exactly when, 40, 50 years ago, was stolen from somewhere in England, and they thought it was lost for many, many years. And he somehow got wind of it on the black market and reclaimed it and returned it to the Oscar Wilde Foundation. But the ring, I use the exact same ring in this story, and it's a big part of the plot.
The black market is so fascinating to me, too. It's a whole other world that I have no idea about. And I know I don't want to step my toe into it, but it's very, very interesting.
Yeah. And a lot of the antique stores, I think that's part of what makes it so fascinating and frustrating is that a lot of people get away with these things because so many people are turning a blind eye. And I don't know if it's greed or if it's, wanting to own this piece of history that nobody else on the planet has, which is maybe also greed. I don't know, but it's, so many people just pretending that these pieces that they're getting either to sell in their stores or people are buying in these stores are legitimate pieces, and they're really not. And they're called blood antiquities for a reason. This is an industry that's run largely by underworld types, and people are dying, getting them out of the countries where they belong. They're covered in blood, literally. So it's, like I said, fascinating and shocking. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Good book fodder, at least.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may also enjoy my podcast, City of Muses. Each week, I chat with contemporary artists and creatives to explore what inspires them, where their creativity comes from, and how Paris has helped or hindered their dreams come true. Check out City of Muses now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So we visit a lot of different locations in this book. Paris, obviously, but also places like Capri and Luxembourg and Malta and Amsterdam and Bilbao and Venice. Why did you decide on these locations, and why make Paris the focal point?
It's funny. So, two different answers for that. When I first turned in this book, it was the synopsis at the time, so it wasn't the full book, but I wanted to set it in Amsterdam because I live here. I love this city. It's a great town. And my editor was like, love the plot, love the premise, but I think, a city like London or Paris would be a better place for this because it is a big plot. And so you need a big city that people know so they don't get lost in the minutia of where am I, what is happening. So, Paris is, even if you've never been, the places that I talk about and the places that, where the story takes place in Paris, they're recognizable to everyone. It's the Seine, the Eiffel Tower, all these places that everybody knows. So she talked me into setting it in Paris. And actually, now I can look back and say she was probably right. I think that the plot needed a city like Paris. She suggested London too, and I like Paris better. So I chose Paris. I also knew that I needed a couple, I think probably 6 or 7 flashback scenes from their 3 weeks prior to ending the trip in Paris. And I knew that those scenes needed to give a clue or answer a question for the chapters that came before them. So I looked at kind of the places that I love to visit and had been, and just kind of went from there. So we had recently taken a trip to Capri, Bilbao. I've been to Luxembourg many times. It's nice and close. Amsterdam, of course, that was a given. I was like, that was the first one I knew that was going to be in the book. So I chose, I say when I'm talking about the book, the places that Stella loves best, but they're kind of maybe the places I love best too.
Do you feel the same way about Malta that Stella feels about Malta?
Yes, pretty hot. Pretty hot. Yeah. Can you tell I was there when it was really hot?
Yes, it felt like maybe she would rather have been there in a different season. I think that the idea of setting it in Paris, once you explained the rationale behind it, makes a lot of sense because there's a lot of running and hiding and ducking and weaving. And I think a place like Amsterdam would be harder to justify all of that. There just isn't the same amount of space.
I think you're right. And I think you have a lot more room in Paris to run around, and you have a lot, it's just a much bigger city. And Stella also goes into hiding kind of in the seedier areas of the city. And here in Amsterdam, you'd have to go kind of really far to get to the really seedy areas. Although I guess you could do red light district, but it's awfully crowded. So yeah, so it's all good. She had a reason. She talked me into them, and I can tell she's right.
Speaking of the flashbacks that you mentioned, I wanted to ask you about those as well. So most of the book is told from Stella's point of view, present day, chronologically, but periodically we get a chapter from Adam that is set in the recent past. Had you toyed with other structures for this, or was this always the way that you were planning on doing it?
So I was always going to have those flashback chapters. I write from an outline, so I had a pretty, detailed outline. My outlines are typically between 15 and 20 pages. So, I mean, I know chapter by chapter, scene by scene, what's going to be happening. And so I had those flashback chapters already, and I knew what I needed to reveal in those flashback chapters. But in my outline, they were from Stella's point of view. And then I got to maybe the second one, maybe the third one, and decided that we needed to hear from Adam because he disappears basically in chapter what, one? So I was like, this guy needs to, we need a little chance to get in his head and to understand where he's coming from because he has his reasons for doing the things that he did. And I wanted to explain those to the reader in a way that felt like they came from him and not another person. So I ended up switching those chapters and putting them in his point of view.
That makes perfect sense because you're right, he disappears right away. And I think it would be very easy for us as the reader to dismiss him immediately and say, she's a fool forever having loved him or believed him or whatever. And this way we get to see his point of view and it's from his own perspective. So there's no reason for him to lie to us.
Exactly. And also, you get to hear his reasoning from him. And then the readers can decide whether or not his reasons are valid. It's up to them, and I love those kind of books where it's kind of gray. You could go either way, So that was what I was going for with that.
So you may have answered this already, but this book has many, I wouldn't even say they're twists. They're like layers. It's like reveals. The more we read, the more layers are unpeeled. And the more that gets unpeeled, the sort of deeper and more intense and kind of darker the story goes. How many of those layers did you know from the outset? Did you know all of them? Were there ones that were revealed to you along the way?
I knew all of them because I had pretty much the whole story. I haven't gone back and looked at the outline in a minute, but I don't think that there's much that veered from the outline other than those flashback chapters being from Adam instead of Stella's point of view. But when I do my outlines, they're very plot heavy. And so I kind of know my characters before I start writing, but I really get to know all their layers as I'm writing. And so I definitely had some surprises with Stella. And I knew that she had some secrets that she was keeping from Adam. But I guess the emotion, without giving anything away, the emotion around those secrets was a little bit of a surprise for me.
Oh, that's super interesting. Okay, I will not follow that up with another question, but I will file that away. And for our listeners, that's a very interesting insight. So when you read, keep that in mind. And with that in mind, I think it might be nice now to hear a little bit from the book. Will you read for us?
I would love to. So I'm going to read a piece from the end of this is chapter 3. And this is after the explosion. Stella was going back to the hotel to get the luggage and get everything ready to get to the cab. And Adam was running back for something he forgot at the cafe where they just had lunch. So the explosion has been, and she sees that it was kind of in the direction of where they just came from. So she runs off towards the square where they had just had lunch. By now, the alleyway is starting to empty out, and it occurs to me this is both good news and bad. Good because fewer people means a clear path, more bodies behind me than blocking my way, but bad because the last stragglers coming down the alleyway are more injured than the ones earlier on. More cradled limbs and contusions, covered in more grime and blood, the walking wounded. And still, not one of them has been Adam. Up ahead, the alleyway opens up and I break into a jog, my necklace bouncing against my chest. I drop it inside my t-shirt without slowing down, zigzagging around the last few stragglers limping by. One of them, a man of about my age, staggers straight at me, looking like he just climbed out of a coal mine. His face is covered with soot, all but 2 white lines fanning out from the corners of his eyes, tears maybe, or sweat. He reaches for me with a moan, and I lurch to the right, horrified both by his appearance and my response. Any other day I would stop and help this man, but not today. Today, all I can think about is finding mine. At the end of the alley, I stop and stare into the square. Sunlight tries to pierce through the foggy smoke, which hangs over the square like an angry storm cloud. It's louder, too, filled with the sounds of shouts and swirling sirens. In the middle of the square, the trees rise up like jagged ghosts around a fountain that's still clattering, and it's the strangest sensation. I can almost see myself standing here, stiff with shock, taking it all in, like I'm floating outside my body. The square is like a war zone, like those disaster sites you see on the news, like the footage from Ground Zero. Only this is real. This is really happening right now. It takes me a full 10 seconds to pick the figures out of the fog, to register that the dark smudges and lumps are bodies, stretched out on the sunken grass, slumped on the hood of parked cars, lying on the pavement between trash and debris next to mounds of rocks and giant chunks of concrete. I scan the shapes for one that looks like Adam, but there are too many, the smoke too thick. It singes my throat and clogs my lungs. I cough into an elbow. And then my gaze moves to the hole where a cafe once stood, where less than an hour ago, Adam and I sat at a tiny table pushed up against a planter overflowing with bright pink bougainvillea, where we scarfed down the most delicious galettes and thumbed through pictures of French antiques on his phone, where he kissed me like we were the only two people in Paris. Now there's literally nothing left of it except the memories inside my head. The terrace, the restaurant, the patrons, and the winking chef, all of it is gone.
Curious about what's going on in Paris right now? Don't Miss This takes you beyond the typical and the obvious, with a weekly roundup of the best of what's happening in Paris each week. Every Monday, you'll get 20 to 35 new Parisian events with descriptions, links, and all the details sent directly to your inbox. Never wonder what you're missing out on again. Sign up for Don't Miss This on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio. We'll be right back with Storytime in Paris after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Storytime in Paris. So, what is next for you? Do you have another book in the works? Another poor widow out there?
I do. Yeah, no, not a widow. Well, no, not a widow. So I am working on edits for my next solo book, which will be out next summer, and it's set in Amsterdam, finally.
Yay!
Finally. I don't know for sure that the title will end up sticking, but for now it's called The Expat Affair. And it's about two women, very different American expats here in Amsterdam, and their lives cross in all sorts of crazy ways. I'm having fun with that one. And then I'm about to start writing book 3 in the co-written series, because that's a series, the one that's set in the 80s. And it's going to be called Real Ruthless Widows. Those first come out on Audible. So if you're into audiobooks and you are an Audible member, you can download them for free. They're out for a whole year on Audible before they're allowed to come out in print and ebooks. So
very interesting. Okay. Can you give us a little insight into what that book will be about?
Oh, more shenanigans, more craziness, more mobster stuff. So this one, so each of the books, there are 4 characters in the books, and each one kind of follows one of the widows. It's like their story. So this one, it's Meredith's turn, and she is depositing. Meredith is a former stripper who now owns a strip club where she used to strip, and she's depositing the night's wages into the bank the next morning when there is a robbery, which isn't a robbery because they take Meredith and they basically kidnap her. That's how the story opens. And after that, we don't know. We need to get together. We are getting together in, I guess, September. We have a trip planned to sit down and hammer out an outline and start writing. So I'm super excited to get back to that series.
You're good at these strong openings, though.
Yeah.
Very captivating.
Opening with the bang, literally.
Yeah, exactly. So where can people find you if they want to keep up to date with what you're doing and your books and everything else that's going on in your world?
I would love that. I am on all the socials, so you name it, I'm on it. You can find all those links at kimberlybellebooks.com. And also check out the Killer Author Club. I do a series together with two other authors, Heather Gudenkauf and Kara Ruda. They're fabulous authors. Check them out too. We do a author interview series. It's bi-monthly, so every other week we interview big authors. We just had on Ruth Ware, and we just booked Jessica Knoll for, I think, in August. So we get to talk to all sorts of fun authors about killing and murder and all the fictional things. But it's a lot of fun.
It's good to be specific there. Well, this was wonderful. Thank you so much, Kimberly. It was so lovely getting to meet you. Thank you again for coming on. Thank you for writing such a wonderful book. And hopefully we'll connect again in the future.
For sure. Thanks for having me. I loved it.
Thank you again to Kimberly Belle for such an interesting conversation. You can find Kimberly on Facebook at Kimberly Belle Books, on Instagram and Twitter at Kimberly S. Belle, and on her website, KimberlyBelleBooks.com. Please join me next week when I'll be speaking with Paige McClanahan about her nonfiction book, The New Tourist. Please check back to see if your questions have been answered and to hear a reading from her book.
Thank you for listening to Storytime in Paris. I'm your host, Jennifer Garrity, and you can find me on all socials at Jennyphoria. That's JennyPhoria. If you like this podcast, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to podcasts. This is the fastest and easiest way to help the podcast grow, which will help me attract more great authors to bring to you. Please also spread the word to all the people you know who also love to read. Thank you again, and happy reading!
This episode of Storytime in Paris was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more on this show and shows like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com.